I'm a female, and this happened when I was 13 years old, so I was fairly naive. I was a major introvert, only friends with a few people in my class. I wanted to be social, but I preferred to be alone and read or write, classic nerd things. In early November, I got a text on my phone that was from a few classmates whose phone numbers I had and around one or two I couldn't recognize. It was a group chat asking if we wanted to hang out at night near a park at our school. My parents, being strict and paranoid, would never let me go. Luckily, or what I thought was luck, they were heading out for an overnight trip. They would be back around 4 in the morning, so everything fell into place. Once my parents left around 8-ish, I ran out the door and made my way to the park. The one thing I made sure to do was lock the door. My parents were paranoid after all, and it was their biggest thing that they engraved into me. Once I arrived at the park, I noticed a creepy figure near the edge of the woods. No one else seemed to notice it, and I already had enough reputation as a weirdo who was true crime obsessed, so I didn't mention it. The night drew on and on. I was having the time of my life, ignoring the gut feeling I had telling me to run. Every so often, I would look over my shoulder, and the man would still be standing there. Around 9:45, 4 out of the 10 people there had to leave due to their curfew. It was getting cold, and it was nearly pitch black with a few streetlights every so often. The rest of us decided to go as well, since it felt more eerie and quiet. The place we were hanging out at was a field that was fenced in with a few exits and entrances. A large wide field with a small park in the back and our giant middle school behind us. The front of the field faced the empty road, and the right and left sides were surrounded by forest. All of the people left were getting picked up by cars, meaning that they went the opposite way of the road since that's where the parking lot was. The man continued standing by the right side of the forest, which was also by the exit that I needed to take to get home. I walked away from my group and tried to steady my heavy breathing. I didn't want to be paranoid, but all the true crime I listened to was catching up to me. The man was probably in his early 40s or late 30s, with dark hair and a beard. He was probably around 5'9", but at the time it seemed like he was 6 foot. He was standing about 10 feet from the exit I had to take, so when I got close enough to it, I ran for about 30 feet through the exit and through the woods. Once I felt safe enough, I started just to quickly walk through the woods to get to the road. Suddenly, I heard a snap and a crunch behind me. I stopped walking for a second and quickly checked over my shoulder. Around 15 feet behind me stood the very same man. He was walking slowly behind me, almost as if he was trying to not be suspicious, but it only made my fear worse. I turned around and walked so quickly, I was basically jogging. I lived about 10 minutes away from the park we had hung out at, and I wasn't athletic enough to run home. After around 7 minutes of walking fast, I had reached my neighborhood. I knew that I could run to my house if I had to, so I checked to see if he was still trailing behind me. To my horror, he was only 5 feet away. I ran faster than I've ever ran. I could hear his footsteps behind me thumping across the concrete as he ran too. I dove down an alleyway I knew well and tried to lose him in a park, making my way home longer. I could hear his heavy breath followed by his footsteps as he tried to keep up. I cut through houses, backyards, and front yards. I finally made it to my house and flew up the steps. I looked behind me, and he had just arrived at the bottom of my stairs. I unlocked the door and burst through it, shoving it closed behind me as I heard him hit the door with his whole body. I ran around the house and locked all the windows, turned off the lights, and hid in my bedroom with a kitchen knife, just in case he got in. Luckily, he didn't. If this was a better world, that's where my story would end, but it doesn't. After a few months, I hadn't really told anyone what happened about that night since I didn't want to get in trouble with my parents for sneaking out or anything. I didn't go out with anyone or any group anymore, and my loner status returned. I began to write horror stories as a coping mechanism and never went out past 7. It was around February when a classmate of mine was sharing a story of some random man following her home on the bus. She described him almost the exact same as the man who had chased me home. Another girl mentioned that he sounded like the guy who stood outside the school and tried to follow her home. I didn't join in, but everyone agreed that he was just a weird guy. He was kind of forgotten, and eventually I moved on too. Around May, I was getting ready to walk to school when my mom pulled me aside and showed me a picture of a man. It was the guy who stalked me. She told me that he had been arrested 2 weeks ago for sexually assaulting a child and had escaped last night. She told me to keep an eye out for him and to call the police if I saw him. I was shaking the whole time I walked to school. It still haunts me to know that if he had caught me, I would most likely be in her position, or or even dead. This story took place several years ago when I was in 7th or 8th grade. My school, like most others in the area, would allow the 7th and 8th graders to go out for lunch on Fridays. That is, provided you brought in a note from your parents that morning allowing you to do so. We would have an hour from 12:45 to 1:45 to leave school property to grab some food nearby and roam around the neighborhood. So, this was one of those Fridays. It was probably spring, because I remember it being a pleasant temperature outside. Myself and 2 other girlfriends had decided to walk to the local grocer and get Chinese food from the hot table. Once we got our food, we decided to sit in a park we frequented that was about halfway between the school and the grocery store. It had one of those colored metal and plastic play structures designed to look kind of like a treehouse. We set ourselves up to eat in the play structure on the platform under the green plastic foliage of the treehouse. It was a pretty big park, with a wood chip play structure and swing set area, along with a baseball diamond and some picnic tables in between the two. The rest of the park was a big open field with an incline on one side leading to the fenced backyards of a row of houses. The opposite side of the park was bordered by a small creek. There were 2 streets bordering the other 2 parallel ends of the park. Before the creek was a walking path, and then a strip of grass with benches and garbage cans placed on it periodically throughout the park, then the small creek. It was quite a shallow creek, probably only half a foot to a foot deep. The creek was bordered on either side with a thin layer of skinny little trees and other brush, but you could still partially see through to the other side. If you crossed through the creek from the park, you would end up in the parking lot of an abandoned hotel. The hotel was, of course, on the other side of the lot. It had been abandoned maybe 5 to 10 years before this. It was the only hotel in our town, and I guess our smallish town didn't get too many visitors because the whole building was just abandoned one day. The hotel is probably 4 or 5 stories tall, and the windows were all boarded up. Apparently everything inside the hotel was just left the way it was too. I had heard that lots of homeless people now took shelter in the abandoned hotel. Additionally, the creek ran under one of the bordering roads, creating a super creepy, very heavily graffiti tunnel underneath. It was a decently long concrete tunnel that was big enough that we could stand up in at 12 years old, but it would probably require anyone much taller to crouch a little. So, back to this day. We were sitting on the play structure eating our Chinese food and sharing from a big family-sized bottle of Sunny D, as we didn't have enough money to each get drinks separately. Everything was going fine, until we saw an elderly woman come out of the creek and through the brush, heading in our direction. Now, this was one of those classic-looking grandmas with a walker, so we were immediately really weirded out, wondering how she could have possibly gotten into the creek with a walker. However, we started to get concerned when she walked past the pathway through the park, heading towards us instead of turning either way and leaving the park. Like I said, this was a very stereotypical looking old woman. She walked hunched over with her walker, moving quite slowly. She had gray curly hair and a scarf tied around her face. She was wearing big sunglasses as well, so a lot of her face was covered up. She was also wearing several layers of typical old lady clothing, looking quite bundled up given the season. She was still heading towards us, and eventually came up to the side of the play structure. She stopped right in front of the ladder of about 3 or 4 steps that would lead you from the ground to the platform we were sitting on. Once again, it was kind of odd as she needed assistance walking, so she would most definitely not be able to climb up a ladder. She was very close to us now, close enough that we couldn't even whisper between the 3 of us girls because she would be able to hear it, but because she was so close, I got a much better look at her. After standing there for a few seconds, she smiled at us. Definitely a creepy smile, but that wasn't even what struck me as odd. It's kind of difficult to explain, but it wasn't an old woman's smile. The teeth were perfect. Not perfect enough to be dentures or veneers, but they looked like perfect, young, gently used teeth. I realized that I really couldn't see much else of her face. The scarf and the sunglasses really covered her up. But like I said, the parts you could see did not look how you'd expect. The cogs in my brain turned, and the stereotypical old lady look made sense. There was absolutely no one else in this entire park. We were alone with this creepy old lady. It's also worth noting that none of us had phones yet. Luckily, this was the age of the iPod Touch. Somehow, one of my friend's dads saved us in the nick of time. Her dad had called her just at the right second. He said he was around the corner just about here to pick us up, and my friend repeated the message out loud. As she said this, the old lady stood up straight, picked up the walker, and ran out of the park. This hunched over lady, barely able to walk, just straightened up into a tall person who just picked up and sprinted away with urgency. no longer hunchbacked and no longer needing the walker, but ran away as a completely different person who, mind you, ran quite fast with ease. It was not someone that was struggling to run. But wait a minute, you couldn't call people on an iPod unless you had Wi-Fi, which we most certainly did not have in the middle of the park. My friend explained that what she did was go to the settings app on her iPod Touch, go to the sound settings where you could slide the volume of the ringer up or down, and it would play a ringtone at that volume out loud. She did this so subtly that we all really thought her dad called her for a minute. She pretended that the ringing was her dad calling her on her phone, and made up the idea that he was just about to be there to pick us up. So yeah, this was basically someone who either walked through the creek from the hotel, or even came through from under the bridge. They wanted us to see them as an innocent old woman, not being immediately startled when they began heading our way. Who knows what they would have done next, or what they were planning to do, but I am very glad we never found out. My friends and I all agree that this person was definitely a man due to the height, as well as the general cadence of this person. There was no chance that this was actually an old woman. It became so obvious that it was a disguise. A man disguised as an elderly woman, preying on unassuming 12-year-old girls. Who knows what his intentions were? I am quite a loner and like to go on walks just to get some me time. This one night on the 27th of November, I decided to go on another lengthy walk of mine. There was something eerie this time though, as I had a feeling that the 27th of November is a night that something grotesque was going to happen, and boy was I right. So, at around 2 a.m., I was restless and made my way into the cold night with that same feeling of dread I had had earlier on in that day. The first hour of my walk was pretty normal and nothing out of the ordinary, but lo and behold, I had a feeling I was being watched. Bearing in mind that it was about 3 a.m. now and I was sitting on a bench in a park that wasn't very well lit. Someone else being in the park was very unlikely, as it's a small town and the only people who would be around at this time are drunks. Anyways, there was no sound coming from the dark figure that caught my eye. He was just standing there staring in my direction. I looked down at my phone to put my torchlight on and pointed my light towards the dark figure, but to my surprise, he had vanished. Me just being paranoid and extremely tired, I just ignored the weird encounter and decided it would be best to make my way home and get some shut-eye. Placing my phone back in my pocket and lighting up another cigarette, I made my way back to my house but still had this uneasy feeling of someone watching me. I am normally not easily scared, but this felt different, like someone had decided to taunt me. I looked behind me to see the same dark-figured man standing right beside a tree just looking my way. Now, I know this isn't just something my mind had made up. I shouted to the figure, "Hey man, is there a problem?" You could tell there was fear in my voice, but I wasn't going to let this creep get the best of me. No response from him. This was just getting weird now. I stood there, and my eyes widened. The man got to the ground and started crawling towards me in a manner I could only describe as insane. The only thing I could hear was this hissing noise, which I presume was coming from him. I just stood there, wondering what on earth he was going to do to me, but in my current state, I just looked at him with fear. As he edged closer, I vaguely noticed something was dangling from his backpack. I guessed that it was some bird or some sort of small creature. Anyway, I didn't want to hang around to find out, so I dashed up a small lane back to my house. Looking back on the ordeal, maybe I shouldn't have headed straight back to my house, as he would know where I lived, but my head was in a messed up place from all the fear this man had caused me. I ran through my gate, to my front door, and quickly glanced behind me to find him just standing outside my closed gate. One thing the man said to me will always send chills down my spine to this day. He muttered the words, "One day we will meet again, and this time you will be coming home with me." The events of that night stopped me from going on walks because I still, even to this day, fear that he will come back and take me to some sinister place where he could do whatever the hell he wants to me.